Welcome to Talking with Tech. My name is Chris Bouguet, and as always, I'm here with Rachel Madel. What's going on, Rachel?
I have a story to share with you, Chris.
I can't wait to hear it.
Okay, so I was working with a student, and he had a lot of, we'll call it resistance to AAC. This is a child who has Childhood Apraxia of Speech, and very much a verbal communicator, but very much no one understands. Very common with apraxia of speech. So the student had been introduced to AAC before and didn't work. Put that in air quotes, didn't work. I'm sure everyone listening is like, oh, I've heard that story before, when AAC doesn't work. But it's worth noting whenever I'm doing an intake call, I'm like, okay, so we've already tried this, we've gone down this road, and we weren't successful.
You keep putting it in air quotes, and people can't see it except me. You're
right. No one sees my air quotes, but I'm doing a lot of air quotes right now, you guys, to say when it doesn't work. That's my air quotes. So anyway.
Because if you implement it right, it always works.
Exactly. So, and that's where we know the biggest challenge with success and progress is the implementation, which we talked about a lot on this podcast. So anyway, child comes in, I'm like, okay, let's figure out if, perhaps a new system makes sense. Let's see how the current system is set up. Doing all these types of things, we land on a good system. I do a team-based assessment, get the whole team on board. It's a whole thing. And there's a lot of resistance with this child, even allowing the device to be near him. And I, was just model without expectation. It was like a triggering thing for him. As soon as it came out, he was like, no, get that thing away. So he clearly had a negative association.
It makes me wonder what had happened in the past with that thing, right? Because
I agree.
It can't possibly be I just have a negative association with it and I've never seen it before, right? It's got to be there's been some sort of trauma related to it.
Yes. And some type of expectation, right? And so I was trying to impress upon the team, don't put any expectations, just model without expectation. Hopefully he'll come around, which this is not an uncommon thing, right? I've had students who are resistant to AAC, and, sometimes it takes longer than others. Sometimes it's you have to find the most motivating thing to get them to buy in to this system. So again, this whole team's relying on me to help guide them to figure out, what do we do? Every time the iPad comes out, there's a meltdown. I'm like, okay, I get it. Let's figure out what is the most motivating thing for the student. And it just so happens to be that at school, he doesn't like when his sweater is taken off. So I guess he gets into school and they're trying to take off his sweater. He's probably sweating profusely for whatever reason, doesn't want his sweater to come off. And I asked, I was like, what's the most motivating thing at school? And they were like, well, he really hates when his sweater is being taken off and he can't tell us to stop. I'm like, awesome. So we programmed a button, actually a whole phrase that says, don't take my sweater off on the AAC. And I got rid of all the other buttons, which is not something I normally do ever. But for this student, I was like, okay, let's take everything away. Because it felt like we had this prime opportunity to get him to buy in with something that's super, super motivating. I felt like if I had other language on there or other vocab, that we might risk someone being like, oh, you can also tell me that you're finished and you can also tell me. And I'm like, no. Let's just get this buy-in first and then we'll expand. So anyway, long story short, we, implemented this. I was like, just pull it out and quickly say in the moment when he's upset that his sweater's being taken off, show him how to say, don't take my sweater off, and then stop. So everyone's like, okay. So they started doing this every day. And then, almost immediately, he can now go to his backpack, get his iPad, bring it out, and tell people to not touch his sweater. So he's totally bought in to his device. And now, we're starting to expand his vocabulary. He has more tolerance to it. And so I wanted to share this story because I feel like it's kind of a random thing, right? To say, don't take my sweater off. When would we ever think to target that type of phrase for a student? When would we also think, oh, let's take everything off the device except for that single phrase? But I think the moral of the story here is if we don't get kids bought into this system gives you power, and this system can help you communicate in times where you don't have the words or you're not understood in a way that's really meaningful and impactful, then we can actually eventually build out. But if we kept trying to kind of do the same thing we were doing, which wasn't working, then we would have the same result. So I feel like this is a great example of how to, really problem solve and troubleshoot with teams to figure out like, how can I actually get kids interested and engaged with this system. And sometimes it takes, it just does take patience. It just so happened for this kid, we found something highly, highly motivating. We made it super simple. And he was like, I'm excited to say this. It's not always that easy, but really when AAC, my air quotes again, Chris, when AAC is not working, you need to work with communication partners to figure out like, are we choosing things that are motivating? Have we given enough, instruction around that word and enough exposure? These are all questions that we need to start asking to figure out how can we make it work?
So something I heard in that story is that you started with that buy-in with the student, and the way you started with that buy-in was him actually being in command of his own existence. Right? Like he got to say to stop doing something and other people listening to him. So often what happens in environments is that kids just have to follow commands of adults all the time. And now in this scenario, wait, I'm in control, I'm in charge, and you're respecting my choice about the sweater, or whatever the other might be, which hopefully is not just about a bridge to language, but for the educators working with that student, a shift in just letting the student be the leader and following along with what the student wants, what the student desires, what the student is communicating is necessary.
Yeah, and I think it's an important reminder, like you said, sometimes protesting is way more motivating than requesting. And also, if kids like the kind of power they have over adults by protesting, another really great pragmatic function is directing the actions of others. So telling other people what to do. You can make a really fun game, like a Simon Says type of game out of that for students who think it's super funny when they say jump and you jump, and they say, fly and you pretend to fly. Things like that can, again, give students that feeling of like, oh, my words have power. Like they just made this adult do something. And so I think that that's a really important to think about, because often we're just kind of in this like, well, kids want these things, right? Like they're telling us, they're showing us, the things that they want. And sometimes that's not the place to start for students. In fact, it's saying what I don't want and what I want you to do instead.
Now, hinting there at the pragmatic functions, I feel like that's what our interview is today, right? Is all about PODD?
Yes. Excellent transition, Chris. I talked with Laura Taylor. Laura and I were introduced a long time ago through Rachel Langley, who has also been on the podcast. And we had decided a long time ago that we were going to do an interview, and it just did not happen. And Laura introduced herself up at ETAA, and thankfully, and said oh, I'm Laura. And, it was one of those moments where we had already connected a lot virtually, but we never met in real life. So anyway, Laura finally came on the podcast. She talks all about PODD, which I'm super excited for our listeners to hear about. We've had Karen Owens on from We Speak PODD, but we haven't really, talked about PODD that much. And it's a really interesting system. The way that it's organized is through pragmatic functions. So the kind of system organization is a little bit different. So Laura and I talk all about her experience, not just with PODD, but also in a classroom where she kind of implemented PODD across the board, and the experience that she had with that. So I'm super excited to share the interview. Before we dive into that interview, Chris, we have some new Patreon members that I want to shout out. Okay, so I'm trying to see. So we have John, Kate, Marina, Jennifer, Sadie, and Laura. We got a lot of new Patreon members, which I'm really excited about. We would love for you guys to sign up for our Patreon. It's patreon.com/talkingwithtech. There you're going to find 3 years. Chris, have we been doing Patreon for 3 years? it's crazy how long we've been doing the Patreon, but we have tons and tons of extra content. So if you're interested in learning more about AAC, we share resources, we share behind the scenes interviews, we share all types of AAC resources over there. It also helps to support this podcast. We have an amazing team that we want to pay for all of their amazing hard work. So we would really appreciate it. We really appreciate all of you guys who have just signed up. So thank you guys so much. Really, the support that you give us through Patreon helps support this podcast. Without it, we wouldn't be able to do it. And we take all of that and we put it back into the podcast. So we just want to say an extra special thank you for you guys who are Patreon members. We really appreciate your support.
So without further ado, let's listen to Rachel's interview with Laura Taylor.
Hey there, Talking with Tech listeners. I'm Mike Murata, one of the co-authors of Inclusive Learning 365, EdTech Strategies for Every Day of the Year, along with some other guy you probably hear on this podcast from time to time. We wanted to let you know about a really cool event that the Inclusive 365 team is doing, thanks to our sponsors, Textel. The four authors are getting in a car together and hitting the road to ISTE 22 in New Orleans. Our trip's going to start in Boston with Karen at the Textel headquarters. She's going to drive by New Jersey to pick me up. Then we'll shoot over to Maryland to pick up Beth, and then finally swing over to Chris's house in Virginia. From there, all four of us are going to put the pedal to the metal on our inclusive road to ISTE. You can follow our adventure as we share social media live streams and posts throughout the drive while we stop along the way to experience roadside attractions and discuss ways to facilitate an inclusive learning experience that supports all learners. But wouldn't you like to join the fun and maybe even win a prize? Then you need to participate in Wish, the wonderfully inclusive scavenger hunt. Kicking off the week before ISTE, we will publish a list of inclusive activities for you to complete. The more tasks you complete, the more points you receive. And since this is an inclusive scavenger hunt, we wanted to include everyone. First, we'll be giving prizes away for the most points, but we'll also draw random winners from all the participants. Also, you don't even have to attend ISTE to win. You can play along right from home. All the details can be found at our website, inclusive365.com, and follow us on all the social channels at the hashtag #InclusiveRoadToISTE. See you on the highway.
Welcome to Talking with Tech. I'm your host, Rachel Madel, joined today by Laura Taylor. Laura, I'm so excited to have you here.
Oh, thanks, Rachel. I'm really excited to be here too. Thanks for having me.
Yes, this has been a long time in the making. I feel like, a few years ago we were introduced and then the pandemic came and it was like a whole crazy thing. But I'm finally excited. I saw you at ATIA this year and it was like, okay, we need to make this happen. And here we are, and I'm excited for it.
Yeah, me too. It was so nice to be back in person at ATIA, and so I wanted to make that connection with you because again we'd been introduced by email, and life happened. So here we are. That's good.
Exactly. And I love that too, because it's like so often we're connecting with people online, on email, on social media. And then it's like, I want people to come up and be like, hi, like I'm this person. I'm like, thank goodness. Because, it's like the little icon you see on someone's email, like it's too small. Like I can't recognize that in real life.
Exactly.
Okay, Laura. So let's start off. Just tell, our listeners a little bit about yourself and your experience.
Okay, great. Yeah, Rachel, I started teaching way back in the early 80s. So I've been around the block a few times, and I started out like a lot of special ed teachers, really kind of learning on the job. I really, you get baptized by fire when you come into a classroom. You really don't know what to expect. But I spent the first year of my teaching in a multiply impaired classroom. And, it was really hard work. And I took a lot of data because, of course, my college professors had said, data. Well, it didn't really mean much to me. I didn't really get it. And then the next year I went into early childhood special ed, and I spent the next 9 years in the early childhood special ed classroom. And I really loved that. But then during that time, I also had my kids, and I was doing preschool all day and preschool all night. So it got to be a lot. And so I started exploring. Actually, my supervisor came to me and asked me if I wanted to be part of this new team that was being created in the state of Michigan. And it was the assistive technology team. And so I said, sure. So, I became part of this Region 1. We were in the state, we're divided into 5 regions, I guess. And so I got onto that Region 1 assistive technology team, and really things just blew me away, because I, was like, what is this stuff? So I learned a lot about assistive technology. And then I went from that to kind of an assistive technology support role at our school district. And so I did that for about 10 years. And my frustration grew because I couldn't get people to understand the importance of assistive technology and how that fit into students with special needs, how that helped them, to access the curriculum. So I did that for a while, and in that time, I'd learned so much from the work of Patty King-DeBon on adapted stories, and all of these things that were working in literacy and early childhood. And I wanted to put that into practice. And so I went back into the classroom, the early childhood classroom, and I implemented a lot of the Patty King-DeBon books. We did a lot of team meetings every month. We worked on vocabulary, building vocabulary for kids. And, I did that for about 7 years. And the last year that I was doing that, I realized that, though everybody in our team was doing really good work, we weren't getting the outcomes for our kids that we wanted in terms of when they left our preschool classroom, right? They weren't communicating. I didn't know anything about AAC at the time, but they left us, and there was something nagging at me. And so I went to work then in between that summer. So I that last year of my preschool classroom, I had heard about PODD, Pragmatic Organization Dynamic Display. And I thought, this sounds interesting. And so there's a whole backstory about how I learned initially about PODD, but I didn't know what it was. And that I can save for another time, because that's a long story. But what turned me on about that was, then I went to the conference, and the introductory conference at that time was 5 days. And so I went to that conference, and the first day I was blown away by what I heard in that conference and the videos that I saw in that training. It really blew me away. And I thought, what, for me, this was the missing piece that I've been thinking about all along. Like, what is it that we're missing with our preschoolers when they're leaving our classrooms and not really doing any different communicatively? So I wanted to go back, and I wanted to implement PODD like right away. And I couldn't get a whole lot of traction because nobody really knew what it was. And so, so I was kind of frustrated, but I wanted to get this word out. Like, I really so badly wanted to get the word out. And I had an opportunity that fall to change jobs. And so I left my school district after 25 or 26 years, which was a leap of faith, honestly, for me. I left that classroom, and I went to work for the state of Michigan in a project, as a special education project is called Alt Shift now, but it was under a different name then. Anyway, I went to work for them, and I talked to the director, and I said, this PODD thing, like, this is really huge. And, he said, well, I'm a trained speech pathologist. And, and he was like, I don't know about this. And I said, well, I really want to move forward with it. And so I went to work with that. I was hired as the technology integration specialist, which was really, it was interesting to me, because what I focused on at that piece was the accessibility of the educational environment, right? So getting into the building was a big barrier, right? I went to do a training at a school. I'll never forget this. I had my arms full of all these boxes. I went to do a training on accessibility. And of course, what do we use? We use the switch to open the door. And I hit it with my arms full, and the door didn't open. And I had this aha, like, if I can't get in the building, how am I going to access the curriculum, right?
Totally.
So, yeah. So I worked with the accessibility of the, getting into the building, and then the curriculum. And over that year, I realized that what was happening for our kids who were non-speaking was that they were in classrooms without the ability to answer questions or ask questions, right? Or really participate in the curriculum. So my focus started to really move towards though the technology integration was important, more towards the student perspective of how they're accessing, their educations. And so that next summer I went to the advanced pod training, and I came back to my boss and I said, I want to become a trainer because this is really big. And so he sent me to the training, and then I was like, okay, now I want to become a trainer. And so I went to the advanced training, and then the next year I started the work to become a trainer. And all of this was all working with, within the state of Michigan. We did some outreach trainings with local school districts on PODD and communication in general, on accessibility, and all of those kind of just weaved into kind of one big thing, right? And so what ended up happening was I became the pod trainer, and then at the same time we brought in David Copenhaver and Karen Erickson to do their literacy work, and started this Train the Trainer project in Michigan, which was really exciting. And so I sat through a couple of their just portions of their workshops to kind of see how it fit into everything we were doing. And I thought, oh my gosh, right, this is really big stuff too, right? There's so many big things, right? And so I fast forward about another year, and I had an opportunity back at my local district where I was still living to teach in a new classroom. They had polled the teachers and asked them to pull out students that kind of were the most difficult students in their classroom. And so they held these interviews, and I threw my hat in the ring, and I went in for the interview, and the interview committee said, we got two classrooms. One that's a high school classroom where students will be mainstreamed into the general ed setting, or we have this new classroom where we'll have 4 students with significant, impacts of autism and communication difficulties. Mm-hmm. If we were to hire you, which one would you choose? And I said, that's a no-brainer. I want the one with the 4 students. And so shockingly, I got the job. Right?
Yeah.
Because I think probably everybody else.
No one else wanted that job, Laura. No one else wanted that job.
Just me. Right. So, so I went into that classroom that fall, and what I really realized in that setting, it was set up like a living room, it looked very much like guys would come in and, leisure. There was a lot of leisure time. And I thought, we can do leisure really well, but it's that curriculum piece. Right. Mm-hmm. So I struggled. I'll be very honest with you. The first 3 weeks of school, the guys came in, and we had, we put together a schedule that was like routine every single day. Mm-hmm. And every single day we had behaviors, right? The guys were, running out of the room, or, jumping, attacking us, and, because it was so different from what they'd had. Right. Yeah. But I still didn't have a real good feel about where I was going. And then that fall, at Talking AAC, our conference, that Rachel and Robin Pegg and I had created, Rachel Langley and Robin Pegg and I had created, we brought in Karen Erickson, and I sat through her pre-conference workshop on literacy, and I thought, I can do this, right? I can do this. And I wanted to take all that literacy that I was, all of that knowledge about that literacy and all the past practice I'd had with the early childhood, and the communication piece, right? So my staff and I were wearing PODD books and trying to, do aided language input, and I wanted to do that, and I wanted to add math into that, right? So I contacted my former coworker, right, and I said, help me with this, right? What do we do for math, right? So she kind of helped me with some ideas and some thoughts. And I came back, and over the weekend, I revamped our classroom again. So by the 1st of October, beginning of October, everything, our whole morning, 2.5 hours was emergent and conventional literacy, 2.5 hours. And then the 2.5 hours in the afternoon were all about math. And what we saw with our students was just amazing over that time. I mean, it was truly amazing. They stopped fleeing the classroom. The behaviors did not go away, but they were significantly decreased. Their communicative attempts were just growing and growing and growing. It was really exciting to see that happen for those guys. So then I knew, right? All of this stuff that I'd been learning about works.
Yeah, which is like, we kind of go to these conferences and sit in sessions and see things on social media. We have all these different exposures to all these different things, right? And it's like,
right.
I'm always like a sponge. I'm trying to get as much information as possible. I'm open to new perspectives, new ideas. But then it's like the true test as a, educator is, does this actually work? Like, can I actually implement this? And sometimes we have the best of ideas with these approaches and all these things, but they're not realistic. They can't be implemented, And so I can totally resonate with this idea of like, I need to see this for myself, like take all the things that I've learned, put it into practice, and then like what happens, It sounds like that's exactly what you did.
It is, and what we saw, really was, it was, I had two assistants in the classroom over the, that I started off with one and then we had some really, really awful days. And so they put another assistant in the classroom. It was really interesting because they'd all had one-on-one assistants, right? Mm-hmm. Before they came to our classroom. And then it was like 4-on-2, like this can't work, right? And so, it really took a leap of faith. And that's what I asked the assistants to do. I said, please come along with me, right? Because I know this is not, this is not proven, right? This, these strategies work. Sure. Absolutely. Those are proven, but with this population and we have to prove that it works. Right. So, we took hundreds of hours of video just of our practices, and we reviewed those frequently, like, at least once a week to look at it and say, what would I do differently here? What would I, right. And so, just the ability to to have that freedom to do that in that classroom was really exciting, yeah.
So Laura, for listeners who don't know what PODD is, because I feel like it's a system that people maybe have heard, but they don't have a lot of familiarity with. Can you just explain, what kind of AAC we're talking about when we're talking about PODD and kind of the background understanding of why it's organized in the way it is, and like really get specific about what it looks like?
Sure. So, so PODD was developed really for, in the very beginning, Gail Porter and her colleagues at the Cerebral Palsy Education Center in Melbourne developed PODD for students with cerebral palsy. And because what they realized with that population was they weren't being given the same opportunities to learn a language as their peers. And so Gail started creating books for students kind of based on where their language were, which is, if you're familiar with PODD at all, there are levels of books that start with early language, right? So it's kind of in a big nutshell, it's a language learning system, right? So when we think about children learning language, typically, right, we speak to them in a variety of communicative functions. We ask questions of babies, not expecting a response, right? We exclaim, we talk about feelings. We do all of those things with babies without a response. And that's kind of the thought around PODD, is that when we're first introducing PODD as a language to a student, we have to introduce how this language works. So in those early books, those one-page opening PODD books, those are the way for us to teach those communicative functions, like asking questions, like describing things, like giving an opinion. I like it or I don't like it. Telling somebody that something hurts, telling a joke, right? Telling a story. All of those things that we naturally do with kids who are speaking. We use aided language input with this PODD book, which is just made out of, initially out of board maker symbols. And aided language is just touching the symbol as we say it. So we model for the child how this language works by using the book to talk to the child about the things that we're doing, but more importantly, showing the child what the child can say if they were the one talking. So we don't use it to tell kids what to do. We don't use it to, to tell kids how to say things. Really, I mean, we model how language works, but we're not putting words in their mouths. And so it starts with learning that language. And as the child starts to put, more and more words together, we need to be kind of one step ahead. So if they're putting 2 or 3 words together, we need to move ahead and start putting 3 and 4 words together and making that language more complex. So when we move kids forward, it's organized initially pragmatically. So it's organized by communication function. And then over time, we kind of gradually move to the organization by category. So that, so that we're talking about a category and then we can build from there. So in a 2-page opening book where we're actually kind of growing the language, helping the child to use, word endings, ED and ING endings, plurals, and all of those sorts of word forms, we use those books categorically. So we might start off with, places. I will go. Turn the page to the zoo, go back to days and times, Saturday, right? I'll go to the door or go to the zoo on Saturday, right? So we can use that to model longer and longer and longer sentences until we get to the adult form, which is where we are all at now. And that, that takes about 9 years or so in typically developing kids. So, yeah.
Well, so one question I have, because I feel like this is an area where people maybe have some familiarity with PODD. One thing, from my understanding is that it is really good for kids who have really limited access issues. So the partner assistance that can happen through PODD, is really powerful. So can you speak to that a little bit? Also, I know that there's now some PODD systems on high-tech speech generating devices. Love to know your thoughts on that. So can you just talk a little bit about, the kinds of populations that this kind of AAC would be good for? And also, like I said, curious about the high-tech option and what your thoughts are.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So, PODD does have a non-electronic and electronic form. So paper, basically a paper book or the electronic form. And so when we think about, who might use this, right? So the students in my classroom, when I went back into the classroom, there were 4 young men and they were 13, 14, 17, and 23. 3 of them were non-speaking and one was used speech as his main mode of communication. However, he'd learned to make requests, right? So I want juice. And he would say that a lot, right? But he didn't have any idea that there were other things he could talk about, or he couldn't just draw on his thoughts and ideas to put sentences together. So we actually, with PODD, with that population, for the population of these guys with autism, for him as a student who was verbal and autistic, what that book represented for him was all the things that he could say. So when he could see those categories, I'd say, well, it looks like something's going on, or we'd say, you're looking at the book. I wonder if you're thinking about something, and he'd say, he might say activities. And so we'd go to activities and he'd say, I want to play music. It was like, okay, so it gave him a way to do that rather than in previous time, he would grab onto us and we've all got scars because that's how he communicated. I want your attention. Right. So for somebody with autism whose visual channel seems to be very, very powerful, right? For those guys, it helped to organize language for them. So they're, for most of the population, they're going to use a direct access book. They're going to touch the symbols and be able to get their message across. For 2 of our students in that classroom, we started with PODD books and we actually went to electronic versions very quickly because the power of that for them was when they activated their on-screen system, right? They were on an iPad. When they activated that, their message was heard immediately. And so they knew that somebody was hearing their message right away. They could touch the books, but if we weren't looking at them, we didn't know, right? We didn't know that they had something to say. So for them to go from the paper to the electronic very quickly was what they needed. So those kids are all going to be using, young men and young women and children are all going to be using direct access. But then there's that small population, right, who isn't going to be able to, through no matter what we do, not going to be able to access the system directly, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to provide them with a way to still have access to this robust vocabulary, including all these language functions, without touching the book, mm-hmm. right? And that's what one of the things you're talking about is partner-assisted scanning. So, so we might take that vocabulary and model that for them too, right? So we're going to model, for example, I got to think of the first page, yeah. right? So if we modeled, I don't, let's see, I've got to think about the first page. So the first page on an adapted, like a partner assisted scanning book is turn the page, more to say, turn the page, and I can't remember the third symbol on that. I'm trying to visually remember it. So, but we're going to model that for them, right? So if what I have to say is that I want to be finished, I think that's in the second column. So I'm going to say, this column while I'm showing the symbols, yes or no. And for me, it would be no, shaking my head side to side, no. This column, yes. Head going down and coming back up, yes. I'm saying yes. This one, so I'm going to indicate the symbols separately. And when I get to finished, I'm going to say this one, yes, finished. And then I'm going to go over, because there's a side panel to that, right? And the side panel allows us to not cut a kid off before they're ready to be done saying what they're saying, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to say, oops, was that a mistake? Another word on this page. Until I get to the symbol that says that's all I have to say about that, mm-hmm. right? So I'm going to model that exact thing, just like I would model with the direct select, but I'm going to model that partner-assisted scanning so that the child knows that there's so many things that they can say still, but it's going to take a partner. For those kinds of kids whose bodies don't cooperate, right? They've got some significant things going on with their bodies. They may never be able to access that independently, and that's okay, because they're going to need help in all ways, right? Just to position their body. And so they're obviously going to need help to be able to access their communication system. Our goal with teaching like a partner assisted scanning system is that ultimately we might get to a high-tech system where they're using switches to scan, mm-hmm. right? So they can scan that system and then still say as independently as they can what they want to say. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. That was beautifully said and kind of articulated. I think it's important to kind of understand first kind of the way it's organized, which I'm going to kind of circle back to that in just a second. Mm-hmm. But I also think that, like you said, there's kind of a subset of population of students who, they really rely on a partner for communication, and that's okay. And I feel like PODD is so beautifully organized and supported in that way, that's one of my kind of favorites for kids who have just such severe access issues. Ultimately, my goal is always to try to get independent, autonomous communication, right? Sometimes we can get autonomous, but we can't always get independent. And that's okay, but I think that PODD, and it's exciting that there is an, electronic version. So it's like a familiar system, right? We've spent all this time and years, modeling and giving aided language input. If we can transition to that electronic system, and it sounds like 2 of the students in your classroom were able to do that pretty quickly.
Exactly. Yeah. It was really exciting to see that happen for them. And then I was only in that classroom for a year. And then the next year, both of my assistants stayed in that classroom, and they continued to daily. One assistant in particular continued daily to say, look at what he's saying now. Right. And it was so exciting to kind of see them continue to progress, even after, even after I wasn't there to keep it kind of going. The next teacher who came in was able to do that for another year. And so it was really exciting to see them, kind of move forward, and get their point across. Mm-hmm. Right. And yeah.
So one thing that you kind of spoke to was you have this classroom for autistic students in that classroom with very severe communication challenges. One thing I love to think about is, typically what happens is that we're focusing primarily on requesting. Like your one student who was like, I can say I want juice, and that's what I've learned, and that's what I'm going to stick to. And I feel like autistic students in particular don't naturally start understanding that there are different functions for language. They don't realize that they can just tell us a story or tell us a joke or ask a question. It has to be explicitly taught. And I think what happens is that we're not doing the explicit teaching. We're just like having kids, use basic communication for their basic wants and needs. And then they get to be older students and they have more independence in getting those needs met. And then it's like, they're not communicating. Now what? Everyone's surprised as to why. And it's like, we've never taught them how to.
Well, and that's it, Rachel. When I had their IEP meetings, right, the very first ones I had with their parents in the fall, their goals had been to wash windows, and this always cracks me up when I think about it, because every time I'm washing my own windows, I go back to this goal that this child will wash windows with 100% accuracy.
I'm appalled by this goal. I'm so triggered right now.
Well, I look at my windows when I'm done and I think, did I do that with 100% accuracy? And who does? Right? Nobody does, right? So those are the kinds of goals, right? We'll wash windows. We'll take out the trash. And that is not, unfortunately, that's not unusual. Right. And so when I sat down with these families, I said, this is all well and good, but we need to teach our guys to read. Right. Because in order for them to be able to be successful and as independent as they can be in the job, one, they need to be able to communicate. And two, they need to be able to read. And so I dumped all the other goals, brushing teeth goals, shaving goals. Like, no, that's not what I'm here for. No. And so my goals became, literacy goals and communication goals. And it focused on expanding their functions of communication. So having that as a baseline, right? What we did in our classroom was, every Monday, right, on my big whiteboard, I would have our learning targets for the week, right? It wasn't a learning target for the day. It was a learning target for the week. And so what we would do is, say for this week, and if we weren't kind of making any progress, maybe we'd make it 2 weeks. What we're going to focus on is like and don't like, or I have an opinion, right? So within all of our literacy activities and within all of our math activities, we embedded opinions, giving opinions, modeling for the kids how to give opinions. And so that's how we explicitly taught those communication functions, was within our literacy. So we made books from Tar Heel Reader, and based on all of those communication functions, and went at it that way. So every day, all day, kids were embedded. Communication was embedded within the instruction. So it was very explicit. Yeah.
And that's how kids learn. And I also like to kind of remind our listeners that, if we only do things that happen in real time, right? Like, oh, he's feeling sick today. Now we're going to break out the AAC and start modeling about sickness, right? It maybe happens once every 4 or 5 months. And so it's like, how do we take that and then think about okay, he was sick today. Let's start teaching explicitly about when I feel sick or when that character in the book feels sick, and start building out this knowledge, because we know that our kids, they need repetitive practice, right? They need repetition of these things to learn the language and meaningful opportunities. And so, I feel like what happens is and to no fault of, teachers and paraprofessionals and SLPs, I realize that classrooms are crazy and they're oftentimes just trying to put out fires, right? I'm sure you know that all too well. So I get it. But it just feels like we're just doing the absolute minimum sometimes with our students with complex needs. And then, like you said, we're creating goals about shaving and washing windows. We could be teaching them how to connect with the world, and literacy, of course, is a huge piece of that.
Exactly. Well, and I think that, when I think about that, you're absolutely right. And, and as I did spend some time, in my career as a teacher consultant. And so I was in and out of buildings. and I would walk past special ed rooms, right? And a lot of what I'd stop outside and I'd listen. I'd just stop and I'd listen. And about 90% of what I was hearing was questions. And kids had no way to respond, right? So, because they didn't have communication systems. But then I thought, well, when do you teach that part? Right?
Yes.
What color is it? What shape is it? It's like, when are we teaching about colors and shapes? And that's something we should be doing, yes, starting in early childhood, but giving kids, I can't stress enough, giving kids access to, especially kids with complex bodies, access to communication from the get-go, right? From birth, right? And I think, I heard a long time ago, I was doing a presentation with two OTs, and one of the OTs was talking about how much fewer, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but like the less amount of books that children with physical disabilities had read to them was the amount of books that kids with physical disabilities had read to them was significantly reduced than kids who were ambulatory, right? Because parents would choose a different book, right? Because they got sick of reading the same book over and over to the child. So the parent would choose a different book each time they read to their child with physical disabilities. Mm-hmm. Whereas kids who can amble over and get the book that they love the most, you talked about that repetition. They heard those stories repeated so many times, right? But our kids with physical disabilities don't have that luxury. And so they don't get the experience of having that repeated exposure, which we know now is absolutely critical to their learning, right? And so, that repeated exposure of text in our classroom, of, the literacy piece with the learning the alphabet, the alphabetic knowledge, all of that stuff that was repeated every single day, 5 days a week for that school year, really does hit home that importance of that. And you're absolutely right. Those kids with autism need that repeated exposure over and over and over and over.
I know. Yeah. I'm happy that we kind of touched on that, because I feel like I feel like sometimes we have this idea that, we're just going to model everything in real time. And that is absolutely necessary and important. That is aided language input, right? Yep. But we also have to be strategic and think, like, how can I also have a plan for a specific core word or whatever it is that I'm teaching, right? And then, create opportunities in a classroom and at home to actually practice those things, to have those opportunities. Sometimes we have to kind of think outside the box and think, okay, so this came up. So now how can I take that and really use that as, a launching off point to figure out how I can construct opportunities in, the classroom or at home to practice these things.
Exactly. Well, that's, not only did we use PODD in our classroom, we used the core. I had 6 core boards around the room. So there was never an opportunity that kids didn't have, couldn't reach out their hands and have access to communication, right? Wherever they were. And so we would also go through not only the communicative functions as a target, learning target, but we had core words of the week. Right. So we would go through and we would pick out 5 core words a week, and we would build, again, our literacy, our emergent literacy strategies and our conventional literacy strategies around those core words and where you can find them in your system. And, all of that just kind of, tied in and really had a huge impact. So, yeah, it's exciting to see that happen.
I have a question for you, Laura, because I know a lot of our listeners out there, this sounds amazing. 2.5 hours of literacy instruction in the morning and 2.5 hours of math instruction, this very systematic, cohesive, comprehensive approach that you were able to kind of implement, in your classroom. For an SLP or a parent maybe who's listening and thinking, I really want to do this, but how do I get started? How do we do this? Right. I feel like oftentimes the challenge is we as educators, we learn about what is best practice, what should I be doing, but then the actual like doing is where we get stuck. So do you have any recommendations or ideas for, our listeners who are like, this sounds amazing. Like, I want to do this for my students. Like, how can they get started?
Well, to be honest, one of the, like I said, I saw Karen on Thursday or Wednesday or Thursday and went through that conference, and I came back to my classroom over the weekend, and I spent the weekend printing out and laminating cards and, moving the, really structuring the classroom to meet those needs. And, if I were to go through my day, just real briefly with you, like we came in and we had breakfast and movement, right? Because we know that one, they've been on the bus for over an hour and they need to move. So movement stimulates, brain activity, right? So we would have breakfast and then we would go outside for 10 or 15 minutes where the guys would swing and spin and walk, right? Get all of that done. And then every single day, our routine was exactly the same. It didn't change, right? So we would come in and we would do morning circle where we didn't call it morning circle, but that's what it was. Our first group of the day, we would do alphabetic knowledge. So we started with the letter of the day. It was letter of the day, generate words with the letters in it, right? Circle. Each of the kids got up and moved. I shouldn't say kids, young men got up and moved and circled the letters, right? So we would do that activity. Then we'd get up and change groups. So we'd move from one space to another in the room, where we would do our shared reading activity. We worked with IXL, which is it's an online learning program. So we had IXL and we use Starfall to help kind of reinforce the letters, right? So we use some of that, those kinds of supports in our instruction. And then we went from there to our small groups. So we were, it was maybe 20 minutes at a group. And then our longest group was that individual or small group instruction. So with only 4 students, and I know people are going to go, yeah, it's easy to do that with 4 students. I get it.
Yeah.
I totally get it. But I will tell you that, people also have said to me, well, you don't know my population. Yeah, I do.
Totally.
Yep, I do. Right. And so, we would do our small group instruction. And during those times where we had our small group, we had one group with 2 students because they were kind of at a similar level, one group who had individual instruction and 2 guys who had individual instruction because they were at very different levels than the other 2. But during that time, we would also move, right? So in that time where we were doing more individual or small group instruction, we had things on the wall for them to do. Right. So they were finding the letter of the day in sentences that I did on, that I would write on sentence strips on the wall and change every day. So it was constantly being aware of the movement needs of our students and knowing that, and here's what I will say for 2 of our students, in particular, one of the youngest and the oldest, the ability to sit and learn, right? To be in an area was a struggle for the 2 of them, right? The 2 middle guys were happy to sit right there and do whatever we wanted them to do. So they worked forever for a long time. But for one of our younger guys, we had to break his work into groups of 3. So you do these things and you could take a 2-minute break. You do these 3 things, you take a 2-minute break. What ultimately got to the point where he was working up to like an hour and a half.
Wow.
Right. It was amazing. And he didn't, it's like we get up and we do these still, academic tasks, but we'd get up to do that and then come back. And so there was a lot of the awareness of movement was not lost on us. So we used that to our benefit. So that was our morning, right? And then before we'd have lunch, we'd walk outside for about 15 minutes. We'd come back in, have our lunch, go back outside again, right? Walk again for about 10 minutes and then come back in and then do our math. And, I think once the guys realized that the schedule wasn't going to change, right, that there was safety in that, right? They knew it wasn't going to be any different. And once they realized that, everything really calmed down in our room. So what I will say, it was scary to get going, to kind of put into place. And there were a lot of there were a lot of days where it didn't go so smoothly, but that didn't derail us from going back to that routine. It's like, okay, we're going to keep going. We're going to come back again tomorrow and do it all again. And what I will say is just start, right? Because you're not going to make any changes until you make a change, right? Until you actually do that.
And, start small, like just start small, and like one thing that you can get consistent with, like can build to 2 things and 3 things and a whole day worth of things,
Exactly.
And that's not just academics or literacy, right? That's communication opportunities. It's so many things that we're trying to do. And I think that it just I think a lot of classroom staff and teachers and SLPs feel defeated, like nothing I do matters and it won't make a change, And so it's just like getting highly strategic with yourself about what one thing can I do that will make an impact, and being okay if that's the only thing I focus on right now, until I get good at that thing, and then I can build off of that.
Well, and what helped us, Rachel, too, was taking the videos. Right. We took videos of one of the students because we wanted to see kind of their progress over time, but 2 of ourselves. Right. And so we would sit down, on Monday mornings and we go, okay, we'll pick out a video. We're going to watch this video and what could we do differently? Or, and in that process, we switched groups every week. Right. So there was not one person with one student for the entire school year. We switched groups. And so we would say, well, what did you work on this week? How did it go? What would you recommend we do next? Right. So it wasn't, the beauty of that was, though I was responsible as the classroom teacher to report on the goals and objectives, the power of making those decisions was not just mine. Right. It was in the hands of my assistants whom I trusted with everything. Right. And they in turn trusted me that I was not going to lead them down a path that was going to get us nowhere. And so those videos really helped us to look at what we were doing and critique ourselves and say, boy, did I blow that one? Or, or gosh, it gave me some feedback as to how I could do that differently. And so I think that for a lot of people, and you're right, if all you can manage is starting off, especially with literacy. Well, communication. 1, have your book on, right?
Yeah.
I made books for each of the gals, and I made the books. I printed the books. I had them cut them out because it's a lot of work, but I had them cut them out, and then I got them scarves. Like we got everything. I made it easy for them to have them on, and once that, if you've got your communication system with you, you use it. If you don't have it with you, you won't use it. Right. Totally. So our biggest hurdle was just starting to wear them. Right. And they wore them. And so if that's all you can do is make sure you have a communication system with you, no matter what it is. If you have it in your hands, you use it. Right.
Yeah. And sometimes that's where I start with families, is like, just remember at that specific routine to have the device. That's it.
Exactly.
You don't even have to model, just like, let's have it at the dinner table, or let's have it on the couch, or wherever, we decide together as a routine. And I feel like that's really important, because first we have to get into the habit of actually having the AAC system around. Right. And then we can build into, now let's model a word. Like, what word should we model? Which I know feels like sometimes the families that I work with are very much like, I can do more than that. And I'm like, let's build a strong foundation, because I oftentimes have very overeager communication partners who are like, and now what should I do? And I want to know all these things. I'm like, let's just get really good at having the device around, and then we'll, expand on. And I think that, guidance is really important.
Right. Right. And it's when you want to do so much more, it can become so overwhelming, because then you start to put that pressure on yourself. Oh, I didn't do it today. I didn't do it enough today. And then you abandon it.
Totally.
Right. And that's the last thing we want to have happen. So, baby steps. It really is baby steps in everything for classroom teachers, for families, right? It's baby steps to get started, but get started, right?
Absolutely.
Take a step. Yeah.
Laura, this has been amazing. I'm so happy you were able to come on and share your experience. I'm happy that we were able to talk a little bit about PODD specifically, and loved hearing kind of your intersection between PODD and, comprehensive literacy instruction, and everything that you learned, in that classroom, and, sounds like you had an amazing year that was full of struggle,
Sure
but
did.
also full of triumph.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. It's just, it really is. I think about it every day. I think about, you know, I think mostly about where would those guys be now if we'd have implemented this when they were preschoolers? Because I had one of them as a preschooler, and I thought, if I'd have known this, right, then where would they be now, right? And so I think about that every day, and I want for them, I want for every child the experience that they were able to have. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited because we have a lot of graduate students who listen to this podcast and young clinicians, CFYs, really eager to learn about AAC. And it's like an area where people feel very overwhelmed. And so I hope they're all listening out here and knowing kind of what, it took years, it sounds like, for you to kind of learn and develop over time. And so that's why I'm so passionate about this podcast, is because we can share this information with so many, educators and parents and everyone else out there. So thank you for coming on and sharing your experience.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. And, if anybody wants to reach out, please, I'm more than happy to have a chat.
Yeah, Laura, that's a great question. How can people reach out? Like, can they email you? What's your email?
Yeah, they can email me, Taylor Ed Consultants. So kind of all one word, TAYLORED CONSULTANTS.
We'll put it in the show
gmail.com.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Perfect.
People.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So, reach out to me that way. That's probably the easiest way to reach out. I'm active in AAC for the SLP, that Facebook group. I'm active in, any of the PODD Facebook groups. If people want to message me that way, that's fine too. So yeah, I'm accessible.
Amazing. And I'll also give a plug for Talking AAC, the conference that you guys coordinate. Amazing conference. And I was so honored. Last year, I was invited to speak. And I told you before we started recording, I was like, I am honored. I'm amongst legends that have been invited to speak at this conference. So definitely a really great conference that you guys put on every year.
Yeah, we're real excited. We're keeping our fingers crossed that we're going to be able to be back in person this year. So we're just very excited to get back on that horse and keep our community together, because I think being able to be together really does help us to move forward and gives us the confidence that we have a tribe behind us that we can turn to when we need help. So yeah, we're very excited about #Talking AAC.
Love it. Thank you again, Laura, for coming on.
Thank you, Rachel.
For Talking with Tech, I'm Rachel Madel, joined by Laura Taylor. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk to you guys next week.